going. Big Ten looks toward the door, as if just realizing they have stopped. We're here. Where? It don't matter. Time to get out. The Indian stands and peels his fleece off. The girl, says Hod, getting up as well. Gracie. I run into an Oneida fella up in Oregon picking apples, says Big Ten, stepping up on the access ladder. There was a spell of consumption went through the school. It took her and some of the others. They got their own little cemetery out back, the white people kind with the stones, probably where she is now. It is a division yard, big, with lots of other freights on the sidings, and lots of car knockers hurrying to and fro with their lanterns. Hod and Big Ten get down off the side of the boxcar and creep low along the train, trying to get their bearings, feet on the cross ties so they don't crunch the ballast. The railroad bull is standing hidden on the top of a coupling, with no lantern and a shotgun in his arms. Run and I blow your damn heads off. Hod glances to Big Ten, who turns to Stone. Where are we at, mister? Asks Hod without turning around. You're in my freight yard is where you're at. March. He brings them to a switchman's shed that is lit up and has a sheriff's deputy and another fellow wearing some kind of badge inside, both drinking from a pint bottle and in a playful mood. What we got here? Says the deputy, feet up on the desk. Got this broke-nosed tramp here, says the railroad bull, and the last of the Mohegans, or maybe the next to last. You come in on that freight? Asked the deputy. You know, it did cross our mind to jump on it, says Hod. It is always a negotiation with the bulls. If you're too scared, they walk all over you, and if you're too bold, they crack your skull. But we had second thoughts. You trespassing on railroad property. That's a crime. The other one stands up then and looks them both over, putting his face too close. Ever do any mining? Some, Hod answers him. I can handle a burley and I can work the timber. And hell, anybody can lift a shovel. How about you, Chief? Big Ten takes a long time to answer, considering his options. And when he speaks, he looks at Hod instead of the man in front of him. They'll stick me underground when I'm dead, he says. No need to push my luck. The deputy and the other man with a badge and the railroad bull all laugh at this. Then the deputy puts the irons on Big Ten and takes him off to jail. The Indian doesn't look back. They aren't friends exactly, but when you travel with someone for a distance. The man whose badge turns out to be for the Ibex mines leads Hod outside and off in the other direction. What's your name, son? They are stepping over the shunt tracks and in between cars being shifted back and forth, the business of the yard continuing despite the threat of two hungry, jobless men stealing a ride on a boxcar. For an instant, Hod considers giving his real name, but then thinks better of it. Metoxen, he says. Henry Metoxen. What common name is that? Polish? The headache is back now, worse than before, and he's having a hard time catching his breath. We're pretty high up, aren't we? This is Leadville, son, the Cloud City. There are lots of lights up on the hill, and they have started to climb. And from the flats off to the right, Hod can hear music. They pass a little cemetery, crooked stones and crosses leaning into the slope, and he thinks of the Indian girl behind the school. You'll make $2.50 a day, $3 if you really can run a drill. First week goes to the deputy down there. That's your fine. He indicates ahead of them. This is Carbonate Hill. We'll put you up in a company barracks here. Charge $1 a day. Meals? That's your lookout. Hod wishes there was more air to breathe, and he made $3.50 back in Butte, but he's done enough jail time for a lifetime. The mine dick gives him a look as they climb. You a drinking man? Kansas was dry, and his old man a temperance fiend, and somehow that has stuck with him. No, sir. You stay in Leadville, smiles the man with a badge. You want to take it up. Excellent. So those guys show up more in the book. They reunite and have various adventures, and there's a lot of other main characters. Any questions from anybody? I can take a few questions. Anybody? Yes.
How did you research this all?
You know, you start with something you want to know more about. And in my case, with A Moment in the Sun, it was running into the phrase Philippine-American War when I was doing research for another book and realizing I don't know anything about that. I've never heard of it before. How come? Reading a little bit more, I realized, wait a minute, we won that war. How come we don't celebrate it like the other wars that we won? You know, our movie Amigo is going to come here later in the year, and I think it's the third American movie ever made about the Philippine-American War. The other two are nothing to write home about and pretty inaccurate. So you start with something general that you're looking for, and then because research is kind of fun and it's very seductive, my rule is no more than a week of research and then you have to sit down and write some fiction. So once I get started, I'll figure out what's the next chapter going to be, where's it going to take us, and then I say, well, what don't I know enough about to write that chapter? I don't stop and I'll do some research, but at the end of the week, whether it's done or not, I sit down and start to write. And then I may have some question marks as to, you know, I'll have to go back and fill in these blanks. But I'd say on this one, there are some good general histories of it. Generally, from historians, though, they synthesize it. I think this is because they're in academia or trying to get grants or something like that. And sometimes you just don't agree with their synthesis and think they're pushing things. Sometimes you realize as you go backwards, they're basing their stuff on stories that aren't true. You know, happens in history, happens in Wikipedia, happens quicker in Wikipedia. And so a lot of what I did was try to follow things backwards. We had a lot of diaries of soldiers, a lot of letters home. I can read and write in Spanish, so the educated Filipinos at that time, the Spaniards who were running Cuba and the Philippines, wrote their documents in Spanish and their letters and diaries in Spanish. There were congressional committees. The Philippine-American War was a very unpopular war in certain, you know, there was an anti-imperialist league that was headed by, among other people, Mark Twain and Andrew Carnegie. And so there were congressional inquiries into waterboarding, which we started doing and, you know, learned from the Spanish and the Maccabees in that war, called the Water Cure back then. So there's a, you know, stuff just in the Library of Congress from the moment. You read regimental histories, so I follow some African-American soldier who's in the 25th Infantry who fought both in Cuba and the Philippines. Hod and Big Ten end up in the Colorado Volunteers who ended up in the Philippines. And those regimental histories are pretty straight. You know, there's not a lot of editorializing. It's just what people did what and how many casualties they took, those kind of things. So you can piece it together. It's just a lot of work. And then the trick is, what of that do you use? You know, what do you want to say in that chapter or that section? And then, you know, there's nothing there but a blank page. So if you don't say something, people aren't going to know what's going on. What are those details of germane to that moment? What are those details, you know, really put you there? Or what are those details, and this is more important in a book like A Moment in the Sun, it has a lot of characters. What are those details with this particular character pay attention to? You know, because not, you know, I make movies, but you know, I need a lot of help with furnishings and costumes. You know, I'll go to a party and, you know, Maggie will ask me, so was it a nice apartment? And I'll say, I think they had a rug. You know? So I'm not the one for, you know, and I can do it if it's work, but it's not the first thing that, you know, so if it's a character who's going to see that kind of stuff, they see that kind of stuff. If it's a character who's not, they're going to be very selective in what they see, what means something to them, what threatens them, you know, how they react to stuff. Yes?
When you sit down to write something, have you decided ahead of time whether it's going to be a novel or a screenplay, or as you write, does the form suggest itself?
When I sit down, I think I know, and sometimes that changes. Sometimes I'm intrigued enough by the story that even though I get through a bunch of it and it's not working, I may reconsider it. Moment in the Sun started as a screenplay that I did finish, which was pretty good. That only followed this one character, Royal Scott, the African-American guy from Wilmington, North Carolina, to Cuba, to the Philippines and back. And at the end of it, we went around and we scouted it and we budgeted it as a movie and just realized there's no way in hell anybody's going to give us that much money to make this movie. You can't make it cheaply enough and make it well to make it doable. So I put it aside for many years. A couple of my movies are based on 3 or 4 page sections in novels that I wrote or short stories that I wrote. I had a short story that I never got to work, and it sat around for 2 or 3 years, and then I said, well, that might be a screenplay. And I changed it into a screenplay, and eventually Bill Forsyth, the Scottish director, directed it into a movie. So sometimes they change, but when I actually sit down, I like to say, okay, this is what I'm doing here. The minute I knew that this was going to be a novel, what happened was, from that screenplay where I always felt like I was cramming a lot into 2 hours, 2 hours and 10 minutes, it gave me the room to expand. And so there's 3 other major characters and maybe 30 minor characters who weren't in the screenplay. You know, unless you're making a 40-part miniseries and filming that, you know, really in 1 2-hour movie, you have to bite off. And it's one of the problems, you know, I've adapted people's novels for movies as a screenwriter for hire. So one of the things you have to deal with when you get a good, big, juicy novel is you have to really look at it and say, is the arc of this novel too big for 1 movie? Is there some part of it, some heart of it, some chapter of it that's going to make a better movie, and that's what we should do, and forget about making the whole thing.
I was wondering if you could, if there's something specific that inspired you to write the story, The Anarchist Convention.
Yeah, The Anarchist Convention is a story about a bunch of old anarchists who are trying to meet and have like a reunion, and they end up having to change their usual venue, and they end up in a hotel chain owned by the Mormons, and they can't agree on the fruit cup, you know, because grapes might be evil right now because of the Cesar Chavez or whatever, and the whole thing falls apart, and that's their history. That came from 2 incidents. One was being in an anti-war march in the late 60s, early 70s in Washington, and it was one of the more controlled ones, and there were people with armbands telling you, you know, go this way, wait, all this kind of stuff. And some of the younger people in front of me were getting really, really impatient, saying, you know, come on, what's the hold up here? And a very old lady, probably in her 80s, turned around and said, I've been in this line for 60 years, young man, have some patience. So that character came to me. And then when I first went out to Hollywood, I met a woman who was the girlfriend of one of the Hollywood 10, one of the 10 screenwriters who had been blacklisted. And she told me the story that her boyfriend, who was in his late 60s, I think, at that time, maybe even older, was not talking to his best friend, who was another of the Hollywood 10, because they disagreed about the Soviet dissidents. And these guys had been to jail together, couldn't talk because of some small thing. You know, and it just, then I actually met Grace Paley, if you've ever read Grace Paley. And I felt when I finished it and I read it over, oh my God, I've written a Grace Paley story. I should probably just mail it to her and have her put my name on it. But she was very nice. And she said, how do you know everybody I know? And that's actually the first thing that I ever had translated. It's all in like, you know, Lower East Side, you know, Yiddish dialect, and it got translated into Japanese, and I don't know what's left of it. Maybe they did a brilliant job. Yeah.
First of all, thanks for all the great films.
Thanks.
I'm delighted you run on this topic with Berkeley American Empire. I was just wondering, last winter I happened to come across an old tattered copy of Gore Vidal's Empire. And I was wondering if you used that, consulted that at all. It sounds like from the chapter you just read, you really cover more bases. He essentially deals with the antagonism between Hearst and Teddy Roosevelt, New York, D.C., where you're dealing with the Carlisle Indian School and the whole, you know, panorama.
This wanders off the road a little more often. I actually haven't read much of his historical novels. I'm awfully badly read. And you know, we're driving around the country right now doing these readings, so I'm listening to books